First off, I just want to let everyone know that we had a last-minute change in moderators. My name is Joe Brinker, and I'm a co-chair of the Truman National Security Project's Transatlantic Affinity Group and executive director at Cincinnatus Development Consulting. I'm stepping in for Bart Shevchek, who had some professional matters that came up at the last minute. And so this is the reason why we have multiple co-chairs, and I'm able to jump in and take over. I want to welcome you today, everyone today, to our event, Countering Russia's Invasion of Ukraine, Key Considerations for NATO Allies and Partners. Today's event has been organized by the Truman National Security Project, a Washington, D.C.-based organization with a mission to unite and equip a diverse community of American leaders to produce timely, innovative, and principled solutions to complex national security challenges. Thank you all for joining us for this important discussion. Now to introduce our speakers, we have Dr. Antonio Misiroli. He is a former Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO, and Dr. Benedetta Berti, who is the Head of Policy Planning at NATO. Few housekeeping notes before I kick things off for questions. Please keep yourself on mute during the duration of the call. We also will not be taking verbal questions. If you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will field questions accordingly as we go through the discussion. So let me start first with Antonio. Straight off, with Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine now in its fourth week, how do you assess the state of play?
Well, I know as much as you do. I think we are all following two fronts, basically. One is on the ground, of course, what is happening on the ground. The state of Russia's advances towards Kiev and other cities, which seems to be stalling, in all honesty. The civilian casualties, the increasing number of civilian casualties, especially in encircled cities, and the risk, of course, of the deployment of chemical weapons that has been flagged up recently over the past few days. So we all keep a lot of attention on that particular front. And then there is a lot of attention also for the diplomatic front, and in particular on the talks that have been taking place between the two parties in this conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So there are a lot of leaks and indiscretions and speculations about that. It is quite interesting to see this happening, I would say. I mean, it was not a foregone conclusion. It remains to be seen, I believe, whether this is just, could I put it, a ploy on the Russian side to buy time, regroup, and refurbish the forces on the ground in order to have another go at the major cities in Ukraine, or if it is a genuine effort to try and find an exit strategy, an off-ramp, as people say, to the current situation, which is not particularly good for the Russian side. I think we are all following these things with a lot of attention, and of course there is a wider diplomatic landscape we'll keep an eye on, which is what allies and partners are doing in this respect. We all expect President Biden in Brussels next week for both the NATO summit and the meeting with the EU leaders on the 24th and the 25th. By then, the situation could also have further evolved, and it remains to be seen what is going to happen also on the economic front, which is the third front in this war. I suppose that the sanctions that have been agreed by the West are starting to have an impact. We will see already over the next few days. And that could become an additional factor in the further unfolding of this particular conflict. But it is very difficult at this stage to predict what may happen next, because we basically know or think we understood what Putin's plan B was. That plan A was The plan A has failed, and we don't know whether there is a plan B or a plan C, and how acceptable that would be. And that is why we are following with such interest the discussions between the two sides, what seems to be emerging from that.
There we go. Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Antonio. Let me shift to Benedetta now. As we know, the NATO defense ministers met yesterday and today, and NATO leaders were set to meet next week. It's clear that the transatlantic allies have an incredibly unified and swift, have had an incredibly unified and swift response through economic sanctions and provision of arms to Ukraine. Can you briefly describe the scale of alliance management that occurs behind the scenes to reach this unity? And what are the next anticipated steps from NATO allies and partners?
Right. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for the question. I think that's a really important one. And first of all, I would start by saying I completely agree with the assessment. One of the trends that we've been able to observe in the weeks and days preceding the beginning of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and in the weeks following that the beginning of the war of aggression, has certainly been renewed transatlantic unity and political resolve in dealing with this, which is the gravest security crisis, I would say, in Europe since the end of the Second World War. So I agree. There's been a lot of unity and a lot of will to work together and forge cohesion and do their utmost to stop Russia's aggression. I think that I would just highlight that to get to the level of unity and collective resolve, of course, this means that the allies have been consulting and exchanging intelligence and exchanging information and observing and monitoring and following these developments for months. And this is very important I think it's an important point to make, because of course NATO is a military alliance, but it's also a political alliance. And it's also, and in these difficult days, we can really see the value of NATO as a political alliance as well, because this is the only platform that we have when you have Europe and North America sitting at the table on a day-to-day basis, being able to exchange best practices, exchange intelligence, exchange information, coordinate, and through that process of continuous political coordination, forge common approaches. And I think the crisis and the war in and around Ukraine has really shown that development, because even in the weeks and months preceding Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, so even before the 24th of February, there was intensive coordination, intensive exchange of intelligence, and intensive consultation. And you've seen this also in the weeks preceding the crisis, when Russia presented its so-called proposals to NATO and to the international community, whereby allies got together to discuss and respond together. So just to stress that this has been really a very meticulous work of coordination. Now, in terms of what the measures adopted so far have been with respect to Ukraine, I think you already mentioned them, so I won't go too much into details unless there's questions in the Q&A. But just to stress what you've said, absolutely, there has been from the beginning, of course, full unity in condemning Russia in the strongest possible terms, for full unity in calling out on Russia to immediately stop its aggression, to immediately withdraw its troops, and to engage in good faith diplomacy. On top of that, of course, there's been concretely the moment of unity, not just of NATO allies, but I would say also an excellent example of cooperation between NATO and the European Union, to work on how to impose cost on Russia for its actions. And you've really seen allies adopting unprecedented sanctions, from targeting Russian companies, banks, energy suppliers, and oligarchs close to President Putin. And of course, on top of that, as you know, allies are providing different types of assistance to Ukraine to support Ukraine's right to self-defense. And that, of course, includes military assistance by individual NATO allies, but also much needed humanitarian support. And on top of that, of course, also allies are welcoming hundreds of thousands of refugees on a daily basis and providing critical medical assistance for civilians fleeing war. So this is just to give you a state of play of where we are in terms of measures taken to support Ukraine in this tragic war.
Thank you, Benedetta. Okay, maybe to switch back to Antonio now. Antonio, how do you see the conflict evolving over the next days, weeks, and months? And what would you say would be the most likely scenarios that might arise? Is there any potential end state visible on the horizon? For instance, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken spoke of Russia's irreversible withdrawal as one precondition for a diplomatic deal. So maybe I'll throw that out there as well.
Well, I would be a very rich man if I were able to predict the end state here. I think that we are seeing a few potential building blocks, in particular from the leaks, from the negotiations between the two sides, that could be part of a final deal that could bring an end to this conflict. On the one hand, I think it seems, and I'm speaking in a personal capacity here, that the Ukrainian side is ready to consider a sort of pledge of neutrality in the future, that is also ready to consider potentially some limitations to its military capability, on the condition that those limitations are coupled with some credible, solid security guarantees. The rumor is that these guarantees may come from the United States, the UK, and Turkey. It remains to be seen whether this would be to some extent acceptable to the Russian side, because all three countries are members of NATO. So the NATO that is kept out of one door comes back from the window. There is a second element that is, of course, the withdrawal of Russian forces. And here, the terminology conceals the fact that the devil may lie in the details. Would the withdrawal be complete from the whole of the territory of Ukraine? Would that be limited to the invasion that has taken place since the 24th of February? Would that include Luhansk and Donetsk, that is the Donbas region, in its original shape, or in the shape that took with the two so-called rebel republics? And of course, there is the sticking point of Crimea. So I think that there are a number of issues there that are not entirely addressed by the kind of leaks that we have received so far. And then, of course, there is an issue that is related to the persistence of sanctions. I have the impression that many sanctions will remain as long as any potential deal is, if not fully implemented, on the way to be credibly implemented. And there will be an additional issue that is related to the humanitarian side and the reconstruction of Ukraine, especially if Russian forces evacuate the regions and the areas and the cities that you have destroyed so far. Who's going to pay for that, and in what form? Will there be forms of reparations asked by the Ukrainian side? Will be the international community that will take charge of that? Will be the European Union and the United States together, the G7 countries that will play a role in that respect? And what is the role that the United Nations itself is going to play as a guarantor of that potential deal, with an ad hoc Security Council resolution that would probably have to seal that? But these are the elements so far that we have seen emerging. That doesn't rule out, unfortunately, the fact that the situation could still degenerate on the ground. There could be miscalculations, there could be instead calculated risks and provocations that could also contribute to escalating the situation. Not to mention, of course, the humanitarian situation on the ground and the risk that further tragedies could also exacerbate the climate also in the negotiations. But I think the elements that we have at this stage are, I think, the ones that I mentioned.
Great. Thanks, Antonio. Maybe I'll take a moment just to jump in with a follow-up from my perspective as someone who's worked in democracy promotion for a number of decades. And as you look at all these different scenarios, one thing that I've been wondering is obviously there's short-term expedience in stopping death and destruction and finding a solution out of that. But I keep thinking long-term, you know, what kind of scenarios are out there where the Putin regime is still in place? It would seem that one of the things that is at the root of this conflict is that the Russian system runs off a completely different set of parameters and therefore sort of views its own security interests in a totally different way. And I wonder if there's much thinking going on right now about, you know, if there's a near-term solution, what the long-term solutions look like in terms of how Russia itself, runs and organizes itself, and whether anyone thinks that can be addressed through this process in any way, or is that just too far down the line?
Is that for me?
Well, either one of you.
I am not an expert on Russia, but I have read myself over the past few days a number of comparisons with the Soviet past. And the main one probably is with Khrushchev after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was sort of setback for Russian foreign policy. There was a big hazard, a big risk taken by Khrushchev on that occasion. And it was basically a diplomatic and security defeat on the part of the Soviet Union. Now, what happened then was that after 1 year, Nikita Khrushchev was replaced by the Politburo, and that brought to an end to his rule. And you may remember Brezhnev became Secretary General of the Communist Party. Now, we rule out regime change as one of the objectives of our action, but I think we may not rule out the possibility that that happens for domestic reasons and with a sort of domestic driver. The difference with 1962-63 is that the political system is slightly different in Russia. After all, Vladimir Putin has been elected one way or the other, and he's president. He doesn't have a deputy. I think that the regime change and the changing at the top could be much more complicated than it was the case during the Soviet Union. So watch that space. I think that it is not something that is entirely to be ruled out, but perhaps not in the short term. Perhaps it will take a little bit longer to materialize. The second point I would like to raise is, well, we have mentioned very often the metaphor of the Cold War in this particular case. I think it is to some extent inappropriate, although it could lead to a situation comparable to the Cold War, in particular a situation in which Russia is increasingly isolated economically and increasingly isolated politically, self-isolated in many respects. And that brings the risk of taking Russia much closer to China. China has a lot to gain from the current situation. It's a weakened Russia that is asking for help in many, many respects. And China is trying not to take sides, may not be able to keep this position for much longer, but it is trying to do that. And of course, the risk is that we to some extent, see the formation of a sort of Eurasian bloc there between Russia and China. Now, my personal view is that is not entirely likely. at this stage. The two countries have a lot of tactical points in common, a common adversary, and the number of short-term interests that bring them together. But I think there are still significant divergences between the two of them, be it in regional terms, in Central Asia or in South Asia. They are more competitor than allies. They operate with very different agendas, calendars and methods, be it in Sub-Saharan Africa or elsewhere. And I would say that deep down, basically Russia is now a revanchist country, China is a revisionist country. And there are significant differences between the two approaches. China is trying to change the current system from inside to its own advantage, but without dramatic developments and spectacular actions, whereas basically Russia is trying to undermine from the roots. More fundamentally, I think the kind of pan-Slavic, pan-Russian nationalism that is driving Putin's aggression is hardly compatible with the condition whereby Russia would become China's junior partner. And I think these are elements that we have to take into account, both on the domestic and on the foreign policy side. It is in our interest, of course, not to facilitate that kind of alliance and convergence between Russia and China, and therefore we have to act very carefully. I understand that tomorrow President Biden will have a conversation with President Xi Jinping. It is important to keep an eye on what China is going to do and say over the next days, because China could be an important actor in the resolution of this crisis.
Thank you, Antonio. Now to switch back to Benedetta. How has the NATO alliance strengthened its protection of NATO territory in the recent weeks? And what further steps do you expect?
Right. Great. So that's the other part of NATO's response, of NATO and allies' response that we didn't touch upon in the previous comment, in the previous answer, and that's incredibly important. And of course, this, just to state the obvious, but let's start with that. NATO's main purpose is to ensure the security and defense of allies, to defend territory and populations of our 30 members. So that has been very much unsurprisingly at the top of our to-do list in recent, in view of the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine. Just a parenthesis to say that effectively NATO as an alliance has been reinforcing and strengthening its ability to do just that, so to defend and deter allied territory for a while now. In other words, I would say since 2014, since Russia's illegal annexation and illegitimate annexation of Crimea, what you really have seen, so just to give a bit of context, is that NATO has already implemented the greatest reinforcement of its collective defense since the end of the Cold War, which de facto means this crisis starts with a very different alliance, militarily speaking, than the pre-2014, with more forces, with a higher level of readiness, with battle groups already deployed in our Baltic countries and Poland, and with a series of assurance measures for our southeastern allies, and I could continue, but I guess the gist is this comes after years of alliance military adaptation. And also after the alliance since 2014 came together to think through how to strengthen its defense and deterrence posture, but also to plan ahead for contingencies, especially including the one we are witnessing today. So practically speaking, in response to the crisis, NATO has taken, I would say, significant steps to increase its defensive presence in the eastern part of the alliance. That means a few different things. First, I would say quite important from our perspective that for the first time in NATO's history, the NATO response force has been deployed in the east of our alliance for a collective defense scenario. This is a very important role and a very important purpose, and the purpose is to signal to any potential adversary that the alliance is credible, is strong resolve and is willing and able to defend, and will defend every inch of allied territory. So that's just an important starting point, and you will hear this also from our political leadership, reiterating our commitment to Article 5 and saying we are taking measures to make sure that every inch of territory can be defended and protected effectively. So that includes the deployment of the NATO response force, as I said, for the first time in our history as a collective defense. It also includes more reinforcements in the air and land, at sea, over 130 planes on high alert from different locations, 200 plus ships across from the high north and the Mediterranean, deployment of thousands of more troops. For now, you have roughly 40,000 troops directly under NATO command, mostly in the eastern part of the alliance, and then 1,000 more troops under national command. Given that this is a US audience right now, there's roughly 100,000 US troops in Europe, and all European and allies and Canada are also stepping up further. So all of this to say, there are plans of being approved, decisions have been made to make sure that the eastern flank of our alliance is reinforced, that our commitment to Article 5 is crystal clear, ironclad, and is perceived and known to be as such by our potential adversaries. And also, of course, to shield the alliance, to make sure that the war that is currently raging in Ukraine does not escalate beyond Ukraine and does not lead to a further spillover. So all of these are the immediate measures that have been taken to reinforce our posture. And I would say these are very, very important, because we obviously have a incredibly important task to preserve the security and defense of our allies. But of course, that's not the end of the story, and we can talk more about it later. But the allies, and you mentioned the extraordinary defense ministerial that occurred just yesterday, they're also starting to discuss discuss the long-term military consequences of this crisis, looking at Russia's aggression in Ukraine, looking at Russia's further military integration with Belarus, and looking at what does it mean for our defense and deterrence posture. And there's some initial thinking. I think it's a bit too early to share it, but the way forward, the direction of travel is one in which we want to reinforce that posture in the long term in all domains, air, land, and sea, and cyber and space. And that includes also looking at more forces, more pre-position equipment, more presence in the eastern flank of our alliance to prevent a conflict and shield all allies. So that's the thinking that is ongoing. I believe that the next time when our leaders meet in June at the Madrid summit, they will take some substantial decisions on how to further adapt that deterrence and defense posture.
Thank you, Benedetta. Maybe I'll open the next question up to either one of you and ask how you might evaluate China's current posture in this conflict, and what steps you might expect it to take.
Shall I start, Benedetta? Okay.
Sure.
I think China was taken by surprise in all likelihood, but by what happened since the 24th of February. I am aware that there is a discussion on the extent to which President Putin may have informed President Xi Jinping in Beijing at the beginning of the Winter Olympics over there, when he visited the Chinese president. But I think that broadly speaking, China did not expect such a development on the ground, as most of us did not, and ever since has tried to find a difficult balance between showing solidarity and support for certain core Russian positions, in particular those that China to some extent thinks it shares with Russia. That is the sense that the US and NATO are getting closer to them, and challenging their positions in their respective region. Probably China feels, as compared to Russia, more self-confident in this respect, in many aspects, but it shares this kind of feeling and attitude. Certainly, there are some core principles of Chinese foreign policy. That is the respect for territorial integrity and nationhood in that respect, that are being broken openly by Russia. And also China had even bilateral relations with Ukraine previously. So I think that is a situation that China doesn't particularly like, although in the short term, there could also be significant gains for China, getting better deals from Russia in terms of energy supply. That was the case at the beginning of February already, and also having more access to treasury reserves in Russia in order to replace also reserves in dollar and other currencies, and acting as a sort of potential partner, a reserve partner in that respect. Still, there is a reputational risk for China on the international stage. China is trying also to see to what extent it could play a role in moderating Russia, or even facilitating a solution that would bring an end to the conflict. And the language used by Chinese diplomats so far has been a little bit ambiguous, not very clear, trying to play both sides to some extent, but in particular, at least officially, siding still with Russia. I have to say that I don't think China has experience in international mediation in this respect, has never played such a role, but could play an important role behind the scenes. And that is why I think that it is important that channels of communication with China are kept, and in particular that President Biden will talk to them. Of course, insofar as we address China by saying either you do this or there will be consequences, I mean, that could backfire in some respects, knowing the kind of attitude China has. There is also a personal stake. That is, President Xi Jinping himself has put a lot of emphasis on his own personal relationship with Putin. And we are just a few months, I think, away from an important Congress of the Communist Party in China, where Xi Jinping is expected to get exceptionally a third mandate. So it is to some extent encroaching on domestic politics in China and the kind of support that President Xi Jinping can get or not in his bid for a third term. And I think that makes things a little bit more complicated for us and for them as well.
Benedetta,
do you want to jump in at all on this question, or?
Sure, I can jump in with a caveat that at the moment I am a NATO official, so I'm going to have to be a little bit cautious on the speculating. It's in the midst of this crisis, of course, as you all understand, the stakes are incredibly high. So I think I might say less that I would I be now sitting in a think tank. So just with that caveat, to kind of manage expectations, I would say that from our perspective, from where I'm sitting, this is certainly an element that it's incredibly important to watch in the months and years, actually, in the recent past. So before 24th of February, we have seen Russia and China's cooperation growing closer. That's militarily, economically. So we had seen instances of that relationship being strengthened. We have seen, and this is something that, of course, we pays quite a bit of attention to, on the beginning of February, the joint Russian-Chinese declaration that essentially put on the table a request for request is a polite word to say it, but a desired veto on NATO's choices to accept new members or to enlarge its alliance. And in that sense, the language of that statement was showed quite a similar view from the two countries in looking at the role of transatlantic security described as a provocation. And there were quite a few elements there that gave us reason to assess that that relationship was indeed not growing weaker. I'll put it that way. Antonio has very eloquently put on the table all the reasons why taking clear sides at the moment would be quite complicated, and why there's some benefit in some constructive ambiguity on China's side. But it is also true that we do see signs of continuation of this. I don't want to say partnership. That's perhaps not the right word, but of this convergence of interests between the two countries, especially if I frame it in the broader context of growing strategic competition. And then if I just want to look specifically at this crisis, and I look, for example, at the Chinese state media and their reporting on the crisis, then you can see a lot of the Russian narrative is indeed dominant in Chinese news. So it is a tough one to call, but I would say we should not discard that that at the end of this crisis, we may end up with these two actors being more strongly intertwined than they were in the past. And I think I'll stop here.
Great. Thanks, Benedetta. More broadly, what other key actors or trends are you tracking that it could influence the evolution of the war at this moment? And that's for either one of you. Maybe Benedetta, you can start first.
Sure, and I mean, this is a difficult one to answer because we live in a time in which everything seems to affect everything. We have said this many times about the concept of security that's becoming much more blurred, that is that it involves more actors, state and non-states, that it blurs the line between the civil and the military. So all of that to say that the number of factors that could affect a conflict, a war like the one that is currently ongoing is incredibly numerous. I think one factor that we have, of course, mentioned, but we should probably start with is the agency of the Ukrainians, the agency of Ukraine. We have seen them. And this is also something that our foreign ministers have recognized, defense minister recognized yesterday in their meeting. They have seen the great courage of the Ukrainian people. They've seen the great courage, sacrifices of the armed forces. I think I start with that because I think in any analysis of a conflict, we should start by taking a close look, of course, at the parties on the ground, and never lose sight of the role of the civilian population. And in this case, I think the example of how the Ukrainian people has come together to fight the aggressor and to preserve national unity is definitely something that we should not just commend, but also put at the center of our considerations. And I think that's a factor that perhaps many had underestimated before the beginning of this conflict. So I think that's important to mention. Then if I go a little bit outside of the geopolitical list of factors that we need to pay attention to, it's of course we also have to pay attention to the role and impact of the fluctuations in public opinion. And that can play really both ways. For now, we have seen unity in condemning Russia's aggression across the transatlantic community, and we've also seen public opinion support for continuing to assist Ukraine and support for sanctions. I think one factor we're going to have to watch out for is, as sanctions start to have also economic impact on our own societies, how to maintain a level of resilience and how to maintain the level of unity. I think that will be certainly a factor that can indirectly influence conflict dynamics by creating some pressure on our different governments. So the role of public opinion, the role of how much are we able to preserve resilience and preserve resolve in the context of this crisis. I am optimistic, but I think that's a factor to be carefully watched. Of course, we need to pay close attention to the humanitarian aspect of this crisis, which is already horrendous only a few weeks in. We have to pay attention to the long-term economic, social, and political impact of this refugee crisis, which is growing at exponential rate. There's already over 2 million of refugees out of Ukraine. There's also internally displaced persons within the country. This will be certainly a humanitarian, but also a political challenge that will remain even in the aftermath, if there is a political deal that is brokered, as Antonio was mentioning. And I, of course, hope that anything that brings an end to the suffering comes as quickly as possible. But be that as it may, there will be longer term lingering effect, and of course dealing with the refugee crisis and the general and the internally displaced population will be one of them. So just to put on the table non-geopolitical factors that I think will have to be at the center of our analysis long after the guns fall silent, so to speak.
Thank you, Benedetta. Antonio?
Well, just a couple of comments to complement what Benedetta said. I think on the one hand, I would not underestimate the unbelievable amount of sympathy and solidarity that the large majority of citizens in Western Europe, Central Europe and Western Europe has manifested towards the refugees from Ukraine. If you compare this with what happened in 2015 during the migrant crisis from Syria and the Middle East, or even, I'm old enough to remember that, with what happened in the aftermath and during the Balkan conflicts in the 1990s, when there were comparable flows of refugees from the Western Balkans, I think that is a very, very valuable asset to play on, even if at some stage this could create problems of management of refugees and so on and so forth. I think it was striking that a directive that the European Union approved in 2002 as a sort of response to the refugee crisis from the Balkans, but had never been used previously, had never been activated previously, has been activated now in order to guarantee permanent protection, temporary stable protection to refugees coming from Ukraine. I think that is an important factor. But there is another element that I would not lose sight of, and it is, as I said at the beginning, what is happening in Putin's mind. Because if he intends to escalate further, he can. He has the means militarily to do that. He can also use the support, including the military support that individual NATO and EU countries are providing to Ukraine as an excuse to widen the scope of the conflict, to test NATO's resolve to that effect. So if he wants to escalate because he thinks he needs to escalate in order to preserve the regime, he can. And we have also to be prepared for that event. Or else, if he is ready to cut the losses in order to extend his tenure in power and to find some way of declare, if not victory, non-defeat domestically, in order to soften the blows that will arrive when the economic sanctions will start biting seriously, and when the news about the body bags coming from Ukraine will arrive in many places in Russia. And I think this is an unknown, a variable that we don't know. If I may quote Donald Rumsfeld, that is a known unknown, but we don't know exactly how this is going to play out in the days and weeks to come.
Thank you, Antonio. And you've ended just right on the mark. We're at 3:45 here in Brussels, which is the point at which we wanted to open up to attendee questions. It looks like we have 3 so far, so I will just go through them in the order in which they came in. So the first question came in from Marla Keenan, and that is, the world is watching as civilian casualties mount both from bullets and bombs and the mounting humanitarian crisis. As you know, NATO adopted a protection of civilians policy in 2016 That talks about protection from military operations, but also how the alliance can work to help facilitate access to basic needs. We've heard quite a lot of detailed talk about military support, but can you talk a little bit more about what NATO allies and partners are doing to support assistance to the humanitarian crisis? And I can open that to either one of you.
Maybe I'll take a first stab at this one. Yeah, and I haven't been very detailed on the military support aspect either, partly because, and I think that's a point maybe worth stressing, the majority military support, lethal aid is being provided by NATO allies, but it is not being provided by NATO. NATO does not provide lethal assistance to Ukraine at the moment. So just to specify, on the political, on the humanitarian side, yes, I can say a bit. I can say first of all that here NATO is playing a role. In terms of being a sharing platform, a role in terms of coordination, in terms of understanding what the needs are, and then working with different allies to allocate assistance. A lot of humanitarian assistance is going also to Ukraine directly on a bilateral basis by different NATO allies, and then there is, I would say, a significant effort in place to deal with the first wave of refugees coming from Ukraine into mostly at this point our frontline states, so the states that are bordering Ukraine, and there is a very significant effort, I would say, by individual allies, and also, of course, it's important to recognize the EU and its role in providing support to these programs to deliver first assistance to those that cross the border, to set up as hospitals and other facilities to provide immediately needed critical medical assistance, but then later on to also start facilitating the next steps towards, I hesitate to say normality because we're very far away from it, but to at least welcome the refugees and offer them a modicum of to help lessen the trauma that they are, of course, going through by being victim of this war. So there is a lot happening in that realm. It is happening bilaterally, it's happening through the EU. NATO is playing a role in a coordinating role, and then there is, of course, also assistance being delivered to Ukraine. Of course, you've heard about the issues connected to humanitarian corridors and the importance of those not being targeted by the Russian Federation, which is something that unfortunately has taken place in blatant disregard, I would say, with all international humanitarian law. And so that's another issue that is worth mentioning, the importance of ensuring unhindered corridors to enable humanitarian assistance and to enable civilians to leave and seek shelter away from conflict. These are incredibly important things that unfortunately we are seeing. We're seeing these basic principles of international law violated again and again with serious consequences for the civilian population. So I think it's important to remind us of that.
Yes,
Thank
I
you.
can only add that, of course, a lot of support is being given to Ukrainians outside Ukraine by governments, by charities. You cannot imagine the amount of charities, also almost spontaneous ones, that have been set up over the past days and weeks to support Ukrainian refugees in Europe. The European Union, of course, in itself is playing an important role by supporting member states' governments to this effect, and also Ukraine itself. I suppose that one of the complications of this situation is that when this situation occurs, normally it is the United Nations that provides safe havens, corridors, and the humanitarian side of this. In this particular case, one of the two parties, I would say the aggressor, is a permanent member of the Security Council. So it is virtually impossible for the Security Council to rule on safe havens, including patrolling the skies, no-fly zones, and so on and so forth, because Russia would veto any decision to that effect. So most of the support has to go through third channels, NGOs. I have seen that even the International Committee of the Red Cross has had difficulties making inroads into Mariupol and other centers that have been heavily affected by this. And the corridors and else and ceasefires have to be agreed by the two parties. So in this respect, I would say the international community is a little bit impotent at this stage because all things happen inside Ukraine, and one of the two parties would block any deliberation at the Security Council level.
Thanks, Antonio. We have a few more questions coming in. I'm going to juggle around a little bit to make sure that everyone who has placed a question gets at least one, because we're getting some questions coming in. We're getting multiple questions from some participants. So let's see here. Here's a question from an anonymous attendee. If the conflict ends up with Ukraine remaining neutral and with limited military capabilities, wouldn't that pose a long-term strategic risk for European security, leaving a weak Ukraine subject to the possibility of renewed Russian aggression? Again, it's for either of you to field.
Well, I suppose everything would depend on the terms of the neutrality. There have been very different types of neutrality, even in Europe. I mean, Finland's, Sweden's, Austria's neutrality are not identical in the setup, in their legal framework, and so on and so forth. So I think much would depend on what kind of guarantees neutrality would be given in return for. And if there are credible guarantees, more credible than the ones that were enshrined in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 that Russia subscribed to, I think that the risk would be more limited. Of course, if instead neutrality was coupled with de facto demilitarization and no other security guarantees, I think Ukraine would probably be left at the mercy of Russia for quite a while, and therefore will represent a source of instability and insecurity for the whole of Europe.
Thanks. Benedetta?
Sorry, no, I think in the interest of time, maybe I'll sit this one out.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, next question, bouncing around here a bit, is from Bryce Barros. Given the rise of the European Union as a security actor in Europe due to this crisis, can the panelists speak to the overlap and conflict that NATO and EU counterparts may have in their individual responses? Again, for either of you to field.
Maybe I can try, if I understand correctly. I'm trying to find it. It's about the NATO-EU relation, and well, I'll start while I reread the question. I will start by saying one starting point, which is I think this current crisis has shown the value and also the possibility of having NATO and EU working hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, and complement each other in responding to what is a crisis of historical proportions with incredibly significant consequences, of course, first and foremost for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, but also for European security, for the European security order, and for transatlantic security. So in this, what I would like to recognize over the last few weeks is that there's been intense coordination between the NATO leadership, the EU leadership. Yesterday, of course, at the Defense Ministerial, we had representation from the European Union, as well as from our close partners, Finland and Sweden, should be mentioned that. And there's been close coordination between all the leaders in terms of EU, NATO, but also key member states of the European Union and of NATO respectively, in terms of imposing sanctions, in terms of coordinating political messages, in terms of making sure that there is absolutely no doubt that we are all united on this. In terms of I understand that the question here talks about potential overlap or conflict. That's not what I've seen so far. And that's certainly what we are working very hard to avoid. The reason is clear. We have both NATO and the EU, besides having 21 out of 30 in our case and out of 27 for them shared members, which is not insignificant, we also have similar, we also have the same values, we also face the same challenges in the neighborhood, and there is really a strong case to cooperate in a spirit of coherence rather than that attempt bureaucratic bickering or competition. So that is not what I've seen with this crisis. I think everybody understands the stakes are incredibly high, and it's not the time to play office politics. We can talk more about in the future how the evolution of the EU as a security and defense provider can work together with NATO. That is entirely possible. We just need to all pay attention and make sure that we that the EU focuses on building capabilities that are interoperable, that are able to be used to fill shortfalls that we have. So there are a number of issues there, but for the interest of time, I'll just close by saying that I think this has actually been a good test case of how we can work together effectively.
Thanks, Benedetta.
My turn to pass.
Okay, great. And that's good because in the interest of time, we're going to need to wrap up pretty quickly here. Maybe to throw just one more out there, 30 seconds each. This is also from an anonymous attendee. Is the increased deliberate targeting of civilians a sign of Russian desperation? Is it possible that resources and time are running out for Moscow to achieve their strategic objectives?
Well, I suppose that, as I said, the plan A has failed already, and it remains to be seen what Russia can or would try to achieve in the short term. The longer the war drags on, the more difficult it will be for Russia to claim victory. And if they also intend to occupy parts of Ukraine, that will become a living nightmare for Russian forces and the Russian leadership. So I think that there could still be an effort to escalate, but as the Russian doctrine itself says, they would try to escalate in order to de-escalate, so to bring a quick end to the conflict. Let's hope that that is not going to be the case. But as I said, they think they have the possibility of doing that. And it is quite important to be able to send clear messages to Moscow as to what cost this would entail for the country if that happened.
Yeah, I'll echo, but I'll be super quick. My short answer will be that we have that. First of all, that I agree with the analysis. We have definitely seen a shift towards more indiscriminate targeting, to deliberate targeting of civilians, indiscriminate attacks, and grave violation of international humanitarian law. It could be very well linked to, and I think there is a link with resources, but I also want to throw in the fact that this has also been a key to the way of fighting for the Russians. If you take a close look at how the Russian intervention in Syria played out, well, that playbook we're seeing to some extent repeated now in Ukraine, with indiscriminate shelling of civilians, infrastructure, and civilian targeting, deliberate attempt to target humanitarian corridors, siege warfare. These are tools that we have seen, unfortunately, in the past from Russia in Syria. We have seen them even prior to that in Chechnya. So there's unfortunately a pattern here of authoritarian of utilizing these tactics to fight warfare. So that's just not a particularly happy thought, but one that I wanted to put forward nevertheless.
Thank you. We're right on the dot at 4 p.m. here in Brussels. Thank you both. I know these are very busy and complicated times, and I think there is an almost insatiable hunger for information. And so I think everybody on the call appreciates the time you've taken to give us your thoughts and to answer some questions. And for that, I think we're all very grateful. I also want to thank the Truman National Security Project for putting this together. It's a great platform, and I'm glad we were able to take advantage of it today. With that, I think I am going to go ahead and close. I don't know if back in Washington, anyone has any closing remarks, or do we just shut down at this point? Okay, there's Eliana. You're on mute.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It was great to hear all of your wonderful input today. I'll go ahead and close off the webinar. Thank you for attending.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for all the attendees who called in today. Cheers.